Hey guys, Fracken here again. This video is about measuring and setting your mouse's in-game sensitivity and doing so accurately enough that you can replicate your muscle memory across your different games. This process will virtually eliminate that whole still getting used to the settings thing that we all have to do during learning of a new game most of the time. Instead of having to learn a whole pile of slightly different muscle memories for different games, and never quite being as good as you could be with any of them, you'll only have to learn one or two. One for the hip fire, one for ADS. If you think your aim is good when the settings are close between games, wait till you see what you can do when all of your games are virtually identical. You might already know that there are websites that offer these conversion values, but I've tested some of them, and even when they do list the game, the values that they provide that I've tested were only approximate. They were close, but they were off by enough that flick shots would miss. In some cases, they were wrong by as much as double-digit percentage values. That's not even a whiff over somebody's shoulder. That's hitting the guy that's beside the guy that you were aiming at. So, what's a gamer to do? Easy. Measure it yourself with stuff you just happen to have lying around the house. When I gamed when I was younger, I didn't really take the aim thing very seriously. I just kind of sat down, adjusted the settings till I didn't hate it, and then I just got on with it. As a result, my gameplay never really got past a certain level. Now that I spent the time and the effort to be able to flick or twitch shoot at least half decently once in a while, I've learned just how important this sensitivity thing really is. Let's have a quick peek at a short clip I did here a while back to demonstrate what I'm talking about with flick shooting in case it's not obvious. Sometimes it's hard to tell at full speed if these are actually headshots, so let's look again at the clip with the headshots themselves slowed down to about 1/10 normal speed. Since this was just a quick clip that I shot at the end of the night before bed and I was kind of half asleep already, these are super sloppy, and as one streamer put it, the hitboxes in Destiny were fashioned in the memory of the Michelin Man. Still, sloppy or not, these are headshots as evidenced by the gold numbers. You'll notice that in one case, I shot purely where I thought his head was, not where I could see it. That's entirely from having spent years shooting into mobs and being in the habit of kind of remembering where stuff is, even when you can't see it. And again, these shots aren't even remotely impressive, but you'll notice that I'm not taking any time to aim in the traditional sense. I'm just hurling the mouse at the target and clicking. There's no fine adjustment or hunting, just swish click. Just think of how little of a change in sensitivity that it would have taken for those to be misses. Even though it's only semi-related to this particular video, in case you're wondering what it took for someone to learn to do this semi-consistently despite being as old as I am and with health as poor as mine is, here's the answer. Thankfully, you can benefit from my experience without wasting nearly as much time as I did. There's ways to practice that I've discovered that gives results much, much faster than this. These days, my group and I are mostly playing the game Destiny 2. When I first started getting serious about Crucible, I had measured every weapon roughly, and they were all close enough that I assumed that they were all identical. Skip forward about 3 years, and now I'm starting to use sniper rifles in Crucible more, and for the longest time, I just could not figure out why my flicks were consistently off by just a little bit. So I got set up and I measured them again, but I did it very accurately this time. It's no wonder that my very short flicks would hit and the wider ones would miss entirely. Turns out the sniper rifles move 6% further for the same amount of mouse movement as my other weapons do. Knowing this, I did a test where I reduced my overall sensitivity by about that much, and then I did some test shooting. Almost every single sniper shot connected immediately when I did this. Now I know that I just have to snap a little bit short if I have to do a flick shot, and they just seem to hit. Another benefit of this was that practicing without this knowledge was causing other long-term problems. Every so often I'd get ticked off and spend a few hours just practicing flicks with the sniper rifle. Then all of a sudden my hand cannon flicks were all just a little bit too short. Then I'd practice those for a while and they'd start to connect again, and now I'd miss with the sniper rifle. I do not miss that frustration. Measuring both told me what was wrong and how to fix it. The biggest help that this measurement and testing process was to me, though, was in setting up my aim practice program. The aim practice program I use didn't use the same numbers or values for sensitivity, and so I had to set this up entirely myself. By getting them both very close in movement, practice in one now directly translates to the other. Instead of practice shooting maybe one headshot every 10 to 20 seconds on average or so while playing, I can use my aim practice program now and do as many as I want at the optimal rate to build muscle memory. It's hard to put an exact number to it, but if I had the choice of practicing for something like an hour in-game versus like 5 or 10 minutes in my aim training app, and I was trying to rebuild that muscle memory again and do it as fast as possible with the least effort, I would take the aim training app every single time. When I first started this process, I figured that the obvious thing that I was trying to measure was the actual angle that I was turning for a given amount of mouse movement. Or put another way, I thought it was obvious that if I move my mouse to turn, say, 45 degrees, and my mouse moves 1 inch to turn that far, then if I zoom in and I move my mouse 1 inch, I should have my view turned by 45 degrees. There's only one problem. It's wrong. After fighting with the subject for a while and being entirely confused and demoralized, it became obvious that this just isn't how it works. Turns out that in virtually every game that I've ever played, they fiddle with this ratio between the mouse movement distance and the degrees of turn associated with that distance. As an example, instead of having to do all sorts of difficult mental gymnastics, you instead know that if you're in hip fire and you see a bad guy that's halfway to the edge of your screen from where you're looking, and maybe it takes 2 inches of mouse movement to swing that far, if you now zoom or ADS in, so long as your ADS ratio is 1:1, even if that zoom is 10 times more than hip fire, if you see another bad guy that's halfway to the edge of the screen while you're zoomed, it will still take that same 2 inches of mouse movement. While it's confusing at first until you understand it better, this concept of apparent on-screen visual movement in relation to mouse movement is very important. As an example, if you have two games that both turn 45 degrees for 2 inches of mouse movement, and one has a field of view of 80 degrees and the other has 100 degrees, it will feel like they have entirely different sensitivities, even though in one sense they're actually identical. This subject can be confusing. If you don't understand it yet, just watch the rest of the video and then revisit it again in a few days. It can also be helpful to go into a game that has different weapons with vastly different zoom levels and play around with them and think about what's happening. As an example, if you hold a sniper rifle in hip fire and you swipe the entire mouse pad and you get a full 360-degree turn, you absolutely will not get that same 360-degree turn if you're zoomed in. And the reason is because it's calculated for apparent visual movement, not just raw angles. Before we start the actual process of measurement, we need to talk about acceleration. I use acceleration, but I do not use the in-game acceleration. So there's no real difference as far as differences between games. If you use in-game acceleration, this process that we're talking about now can become unworkable. I do plan on doing a video detailing acceleration, how to use it, set it up, fine-tune it, and all that. But right now, this stuff only applies to setting up mouse sensitivity without acceleration and without smoothing. If you use in-game smoothing sometimes, that's probably fine. Just make sure that you do all the measurements and setup with acceleration and smoothing all turned off, both in the game that you're measuring and in the game that you're setting up, and only turn smoothing on when you're done. Some mice track better than others on different surfaces. As an example, the wireless optical ones that I use for my general desktop work are outstanding on almost any surface as long as it has some texture of some kind. My daily driver for gaming, on the other hand, only tracks well on darker surfaces like a dark black gaming mousepad. You need to be aware of this possibility while doing this process. If you want to be sure that it's tracking properly, simply do the measurement like we're about to explain, and then move back to the initial measurement mark. If it doesn't move back to almost exactly the same place, you either have acceleration or smoothing turned on, or it's not tracking properly on the surface. We'll talk more about how to deal with this later. Okay, so let's talk about the actual process. First, at bare minimum, the supplies that you'll need are some tape, a piece of thin plastic or thin cardboard like a business card or something cut from a cereal box or something like that, a pencil, some scissors, and some paper. If you happen to have an accurate machinist-type digital caliper, you can use it to actually write down the values and average them. Some large sticky notes can also be of great help in some cases. First, let's look at a short clip of me doing the process. The process of measurement itself is actually pretty simple. It's just tedious. All you're doing here is this: moving to an in-game on-screen reference point and holding your mouse there, marking your mouse's position for that on-screen in-game reference point, moving the mouse again until you get one screen width of movement, using that same on-screen in-game reference point, and holding the mouse there again, then marking the mouse's position again. That's it. The distance between those two marks is how far your mouse has to move for one display width's worth of movement. If your game doesn't let you see the edges of your screen, the same process can be done slightly less accurately by using a sticky note stuck to your monitor as a reference for the start and the stop points. If you do use the sticky note method, remember to use that same size sticky note for both measurement and calibration. You're calibrating the distance moved by one game to equal the distance moved by another game. It's also important to remember that the smaller the movement distance you use for measuring, the less accurate you'll be. Remember that if hip fire and ADS or zoomed fire aren't identical, you'll need to measure both, or at bare minimum the one that you use for the most accurate shooting. For me, this is simple because ADS is exactly half my sensitivity for hip fire, but remember to keep this in mind. First, take your plastic or cardboard and cut it a little piece like you see in this image here. Now, securely tape this to the bottom of your mouse like you see in this other image. Make sure that you aren't covering up any part of the optical sensor area. The optical sensor area is that little clear lens that you see on the bottom of your mouse. Tape it to the side of your mouse that will be the easiest for you to get at while it's face down so that you can draw a mark on the paper while holding the mouse in position with your aiming hand. If your mouse tracks well on white paper, you can just go ahead and place a sheet of it on your mouse pad. If you need to, feel free to cut the paper down in size to fit. You can test if it's tracking well on the white paper by putting your mouse on the sheet of paper and then in-game, putting your crosshairs as accurately on an in-game object as you can, then marking that position on the paper with your pencil so that you know precisely where the mouse was. Then, moving the crosshairs away and looking around a bit, move it back to that original marked position on the paper. If it's not very close to the original position when you get back to your pencil mark, it's probably not tracking right. Remember to be mindful of what you're doing here and why. If you're testing tracking and mark the start point and then lift the mouse and plop it back down somewhere, and then go to see if the on-screen reference point still aligns with the pencil mark for the mouse location, even if your mouse tracked perfectly, your on-screen reference point will no longer be aligned with your pencil mark. If it turns out that your mouse doesn't track worth a darn on white paper, you can just cut a slip of paper that's 2 or 3 inches tall and tape it securely in place on your mouse pad and use that instead. Then you'll need to do it with the paper in a position like this image here, looking at the bottom of the mouse. Obviously this is upside down. This image here shows you how you can get around this. By moving the cardboard measuring thing slightly above or below the sensor, you can have the sensor itself track on the mouse pad and have the cardboard thing over the paper so that you can still mark it. Be very, very, very careful not to turn your mouse while you're doing this process and keep your mouse perfectly vertical. Also, make sure to tape this paper down to the mouse pad securely. If the paper moves relative to your mouse pad, you absolutely have to start over. Remember, accuracy counts, and as trivial as this process is, it's easy to screw it up. Be very careful and be very methodical. Go into the game that has the most settings that you want to replicate, aka the one that you're good with and has the settings that you like. Now find yourself a nice quiet area on the map where you won't get disturbed. Look around and pick an object that has a sharp vertical line or a texture or something like that that you can use as a reference. It can be a wall, a tall object, it doesn't really matter, whatever. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to turn until that object is just at the very edge of your screen so that you can just barely see a single pixel of it. Then you'll mark this position on your paper with your pencil, and then move your mouse again until that reference point is at the other side of your monitor, again just 1 pixel or so showing. Then mark your paper again. Done. That's one measurement. When you do this process for hip fire, you just move the mouse and do the marking. It's pretty straightforward. But when you're measuring your ADS or zoomed fire, which is often the more important one, you need to do this entire process with the zoom button, probably your right mouse button, held down the entire time. If you slip, start over. Hold the zoom button down. Move the mouse to the right spot, mark the paper. Move it to the next spot, mark the paper again, and then let go of the zoom button. It can be tedious, but the more accurately that you do this, the better your payoff will be. And once you know what you're doing, it's actually a pretty quick process. Okay, so how do you get your other games set up? Simple. Do the same process that you just did, but you do it in reverse. Put your mouse on the paper or however you needed to do it to get it to track right, and use in-game objects as reference points and use your pencil marks that you made as guides. Moving your mouse the same distance in hip fire in the new game should result in the same amount of movement as it was in the old game. If it turns out that it's too sensitive and you go past your on-screen reference points before you even make it to your paper measurement marks, then you need to turn the sensitivity down by making your numbers lower. This is for the new game. If you move the mouse the whole distance and the screen hasn't moved far enough yet, make those in-game mouse sensitivity values bigger or more sensitive. Just jiggle these values until they get as close as you can get. This process can be a pain, so you may want to put your measuring paper somewhere safe or even mark those distances onto a couple of different pieces of paper and then keep them safe. Remember to keep your little cardboard measuring thing that you made as well. Where you tape it on the mouse isn't really critical, but it should be taped on securely so that it doesn't move around while you're doing this. And that's it. This is the same process that I use to do all my own measurement work. It's something that's kind of tedious, but you really only need to do it once. If you start taking a game a little bit more seriously, especially if you use aim training programs, this process here can be the difference between being okay at the end of practice and being absolutely amazing. As always, GG's and good luck. Get off my lawn!